All right. We're going to transition to the next speaker. Hi, Valerie. Yeah. Our next speaker as we finalize another academic presentation before the lunch break. So if you can hang in with us here for a minute. The goal was to lead off with Nathan, set a real framework for us to all think about, and then have this compelling discussion with industry. And I'm sure you all feel like I do. It's just incredible to hear how beautifully these panelists speak about West Virginia and the opportunities that exist for their companies. And these are really companies of the future, and that's part of the undercurrent of what we're doing here today. So hearing how they're describing their needs and their selection in West Virginia really sets the tone for what the future of industry will be looking like. So our speaker before lunch, I'm so pleased to be introducing, and was just delighted when she agreed to join this program today. Valerie Karplus is an associate professor of engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. And her background is really special in its appropriate suiting for the topic of discussion on this program. At Carnegie Mellon, she runs the Laboratory for Energy and Organizations at the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. And she really specializes in looking at regions and organizations operating in places that have a diverse geography and really specialized industry context. That's us here in West Virginia. She focuses a lot of her work on decarbonization of global corporate and industrial supply chains, building off Nathan, regional approaches to low carbon transition, and integrated design and evaluation of energy, air quality, and climate policies. This is very dense work. It's very data-driven. It's very, very complex. And we're so lucky to have her with us today. Valerie holds a bachelor's in biochemistry and political science from Yale, and a PhD in engineering systems from MIT, which is where she and I first got to meet. So I was really glad to see Carnegie Mellon bring her to Pittsburgh, which is even better. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Valerie, and she does plan to try to leave a little bit of time in the end for questions before we transition over to lunch.
Great. Thank you so much. Good morning. Can everyone hear me? I'm going to try to keep everyone awake and energized, since I know I am the only thing between you and food, and that is never a good place to be. So this morning, I'm essentially here in a couple of capacities with a couple of hats on. I guess maybe first and foremost, I feel like I'm a relatively new resident member of this region. I drove down from Pittsburgh this morning, and I feel a little bit like an ambassador, because I'm going to show you some data from Pennsylvania, Southwest. However, I'm also going to try to make that relevant and interesting for each of you and your organizations here. The second hat that I often wear is the one, actually it's the one with the pocket protector, right? I am the academic in the room. I'm often the one who's questioning the data, presenting the models, getting deep into those details, and I'm going to try not to do that as much today, but I'm happy to go there in the Q&A and during lunch if you like. And then finally, I'm here as a cheerleader for the energy transition as a whole, but also in particular for the role that this region can play in our global, not just regional, not just national, but global energy transition. And I'll try to kind of set that context with my remarks. So jumping right in, let's start with the really big picture here. So if we think about sort of what's driving energy investments, if you turn to the latest International Energy Agency reports, they'll point immediately to the Russia-Ukraine war on the heels of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're in essentially a new era, one that Dan Yergin, I'm glad that was brought up on the last panel, because I read the new map while I was in the middle of I think it was January of 2021, during the pandemic, when I was just about to give birth to my son, thinking to myself, the future is going to be really different from what this book has basically portrayed. It was written right on the eve of the pandemic. So with these new developments, we're seeing actually on the heels of these developments a new area in industrial and climate policy, not just in this country, but globally. So in the United States, of course, we have the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS and Science, Inflation Reduction Act, kind of the staples. But there is a lot more going on on the informal side in terms of the norms and the ways that we interact with each other, the ways that we emphasize community benefits in our plans and in our thinking as we go forward with these major investments. And on the global side, other countries are moving forward too. So in particular in the European Union, they're continuing the legacy of leadership with the Fit for 55, redoubling their commitment to their emissions trading system. Energy transition programs are underway, of course, across Asia, in part because of, particularly in the case of China, the large share of global emissions that those nations represent. So this is a global challenge, right? And climate policy, I think the climate imperative, I'll briefly come back to that in a minute, something we should try to keep as much as possible in our minds and think from a global perspective as well as from a regional perspective. We also have, of course, the new wave of tensions between the US and China. I know I've had a long history of strong collaboration with researchers in China. I know WVU has as well. We need to be working together. At the same time, we need to be respecting that there are domestic needs and opportunities to work in parallel as we advance the energy transition. Self-reliance will raise some new risks, even as it brings opportunities. And of course, the rising cost of capital has anyone who wants to invest in the energy transition looking a little worried, right? So where does our region fit within these broader forces? And just to set the stage, I think, there we go. I think we all know by now that the world needs to act to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. You can't, it's a little hard to see here, but this gap between where we're heading and where we need to be heading, this is global greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 equivalent. This yawning gap is what we face as a globe. And if we don't get onto that green path, that 1.5 degrees C compatible path, we're in a position where we're going to hit tipping points, like the melting of the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, like where my sister spends her Christmases, by the way, to make sure that it's, or to understand the status and the potential for that kind of significant tipping point to actually happen and cause unprecedented sea level rise, et cetera. We are also facing increasing summer heat, severe storms. I think it's obvious that we need to act now, but at the same time, the places where the action needs to happen, and I'm not sure I'm pushing the right button here, but there we go, are the places that have been, where the emissions are occurring, right? So we need to make sure that we have systems and investment plans that take care of regions that are going to be harder hit. We want to keep the manufacturing, we want to grow the manufacturing, we want to keep the economy and grow the economies while figuring out how to reduce the carbon emissions associated with energy upstream. And so that, as you start to see some of these dire headlines, you think, what regional responses and strategies? I think this needs to come from within, honestly. These are very close to home realities for many of the people that I interact with. And it's important that we don't lose sight of some of the challenges, the job loss that certainly in Southwest Pennsylvania we've been facing for the last 5 to 10 years. So I think I'm pointing this at the wrong thing. There we go. So if we think about what we're targeting, the energy sector is responsible for about 79% of global U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, it's a little bit less. So we're looking mainly at carbon dioxide, but also methane, which is, it comes from pipelines, infrastructure, et cetera. And then nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases are also in focus, right? So we don't want to leave any greenhouse gas, any opportunity out. We want to look for the most cost-effective ways to address the problem. If we look at how this breaks down across sectors, in the U.S. as a whole, You have transportation followed by electricity and industry. Agriculture is not trivial. And then you have commercial and residential. This is us going about our daily lives. The industrial sector dwarfs that. And if we look at our region, this is just southwest Pennsylvania. I think the picture in West Virginia, slightly more higher share of electric power relative to industry because of the reliance on coal, but nevertheless, the picture is more industry, more electric power as a share of total emissions, with transportation as a much smaller share of the total relative to our national average, right? So we need to be thinking about what are the exciting opportunities in electric power, in industry, what are the cost-effective solutions, what role can hydrogen play, what role can a cleaner, more robust and expanded resilient electric grid play in this transition. So as we start to get there, I'm going to propose a recipe. And as with any recipe, as you all know, in your own kitchen, you kind of make a few changes, right? This is not the only recipe, and this is just one that I want to sort of, for those of you who are maybe, kind of trying to get your minds around this topic, this was a helpful way that I found to think about the problem. So what do we actually need in order to solve this significant global challenge? First, we need technologies that actually lower greenhouse gas emissions. You would be surprised at what kind of sleight of hand you can do with some of the calculations when you're putting together your life cycle assessment. It's important to get the technologies that lower emissions. Otherwise, we can think about other opportunities, business as usual, but we shouldn't fool ourselves. And I think that point has been mentioned already today. Infrastructure is also extremely important. So this is your electric grid, first and foremost. Our Department of Energy forecasts that we'll need twice as much electric power by mid-century. We need to prepare for that now, and we need to make sure those systems are resilient to the increasingly severe storms that we're going to face over the next several decades. We also need to think about hydrogen and carbon capture and sequestration as enabling infrastructures that may be connected. For example, if we are going to use natural gas to produce hydrogen as hubs in this region and on the Gulf Coast foresee, then we need to use carbon capture to abate the emissions from that process. So carbon capture, arguably, is really going to be very important as an enabler in many parts of the energy system. And we should think about where that makes sense, from chemicals to steel making to electric power. That infrastructure is important, first of all, to support through policy, but also to familiarize people with what it is and how it works. Same for hydrogen. I'll come back to that point in just a sec. We need policy that generates clarity and rewards the early movers. So we have a lot of this now with our current generation of industrial policy. We need jobs and community benefits that are going to last. Now, the fifth ingredient is kind of like maybe the leaven in the bread, right? So you actually, in order to kind of get all these pieces to work together, you really need that goodwill and that trust and the accountability in order to see all of these pieces create a recipe that results in a birthday cake you'd like to eat. Now, complicate that with businesses, government, workers, and communities all have to work together to bake this birthday cake. That's not easy, right? This is a coordination challenge. And in some cases, it's going to work better in parallel with good communication, and other times it's going to work well as a big tent. And we have to be open, and we have to be willing to see it in from different perspectives, to listen to each other, think about, if I do it your way, that's okay, that's great, we get to the same outcome. This is, at its heart, I think, a willingness to kind of problem solve and talk to each other and work together. So where will the ingredients come from? And I think this goes directly to this crosstalk between the industry panel and the education panels, and essentially the theme of today's conference. So I should actually give credit where credit is due. I'm looking right at Betsy McIntyre, and I thinking of a recent conversation. Sam Taylor was also on a call just to exchange some thinking about what are some of the educational needs and challenges, coming from different parts of the education and training pipeline. Betsy's organization team has done quite a lot of work at the community college level. We come from four-year universities. There are also those who are thinking in depth about STEM education and training at the K through 12 level. How do we bring this together? How do we strengthen all stages of that pipeline here? How do we engage youngsters in energy careers? One of the biggest challenges that I've heard is that youngsters really don't have opportunities to learn that sort of energy systems thinking, the interdisciplinary skill set, the way of pulling from different disciplines, and in a sort of smaller scale, having that recipe for how you navigate some of these challenges, how you develop a life cycle assessment or a techno-economic analysis, how you plan for a project let's imagine, if you're looking at Nucor as a future career path, how do you move into that direction? How do you integrate efforts across different types of education and training? And how do you prepare workers with these multidisciplinary skill sets? And then finally, one of the things that we're learning in Southwest Pennsylvania is you have to find ways of asking the workers against a backdrop of a very strong distrust. How do you bring labor into this conversation and truly create that, get a sense of what workers want and need in order to engage in some of these clean energy jobs and opportunities and stay involved? And then how can we also give workers assurance that training is going to actually result in a job? I'll talk briefly about some ways of thinking about that in just a moment. And then finally, the educational process needs to be directly connected with community outreach, even going door to door, trying to understand. For example, we did a survey with focus groups. One of my students led focus groups asking residents in the Pittsburgh area about hydrogen, just to sort of try to elicit their mental models. What did they know about it? What did they think about it? Did they have a view on whether hydrogen should be produced from renewable sources, from natural gas, here in the region, with carbon capture? We found a lot of, first of all, very limited knowledge, extremely limited knowledge about the details of what these systems look like, and very strong distrust, but also skepticism about sort of whether it would be dangerous and how challenging would it be to store carbon dioxide for long periods of time. Would it leak? Will it? Is it? What kind of substance is it? We forget that often at the ground level there is a need to sort of understand the starting point and what people's mental models look like. And that's something that we at Carnegie Mellon do in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy, and we try to sort of translate between these difficult scientific topics on the one hand and the need to meet people where they are, understand their existing perceptions, biases, mental models, fears, et cetera. So if we think about workforce opportunities, by the way, I think this goes a little bit to the final question on the last panel. So we in Southwest Pennsylvania, we'll just take the example of the recent construction over the last 5-ish years or so of the Shell Polymers Monaca facility, which is a large chemical plant in Beaver County. Now these are change in jobs in energy and advanced materials in the 13-county, so it's a little bit broader than sort of the traditional 10-county region of Southwest Pennsylvania between 2016 and 2021. We really wanted to capture the full labor shed here, and we've got a number of different sectors in energy and advanced materials. You can see that construction products and services by far was the one that had the greatest jump, and this was related to the construction of this plant. Question is, how many of those jobs are going to stay, and what does the future look like long term? We need to be asking these questions. We need to differentiate between the construction, the manufacturing, the operations and maintenance jobs, and think about which of those it makes sense to bring back onshore at what point in time. There is a lot of devil in the details in terms of thinking about planning for providing for the workforce. And this is just a case in point where you can have these big jumps, and you want to make sure that we can maintain or smooth those fluctuations over time, and make sure that those are actually connecting with the needs and interests of the communities. And then finally, again, I want to just emphasize this point. I think we really need to be thinking about how to strengthen the workforce in the power sector, in particular around grid resilience and ability of the grid to handle a much larger set of diverse loads that also are in two-way communication with each other and with the grid. This includes electric vehicles. In parts of Europe where there's a very high level of penetration of electric vehicles, there's not enough available electricity at the feeder level to be able to confidently charge all of your vehicles. And so you have red zones or orange zones in Amsterdam where you cannot site more electric vehicle chargers. We need to think about and plan for this type of increase in demand. At the same time, I think it's important to remember that industry is going to need a lot more electricity for that electric arc furnace, for the production of DRI if it's from green hydrogen. Green hydrogen comes from or is produced with a lot of clean electricity. At the same time, if you're going to run that carbon capture plant, that's a 40 megawatt power plant. That's a big load that you're going to need to serve. So electricity will be a backbone of this new economy. Now, if we think about sort of preparing the workforce, I want to sort of give you a little bit of a sense of how important it is to think about matching skills at a very granular level. So if you look at sort of the types of jobs that are expected to be created in a clean energy transition, they fall into different categories: management occupations, installation, maintenance, and repair, production occupations. And if you just look at job postings, so this is data crowdsourced from job postings that focuses on the key skills that are needed for different operations. The project management, is really different from housekeeping or machinery or preventative maintenance in the installation, maintenance, and repair category. And then production, which accounts for about 80% of those manufacturing and energy jobs. Here you need forklift truck credentials, machinery, again, grinding machine, things that these are, and again, you can take these skills and even get more granular about how much manual dexterity do you need, and think about offering jobs that are going to match these skills, as well as the wishes, the salary requirements, the benefits requirements, and interests of potential workers. And so I think it's important to think about how can we get more granular and better about understanding what those needs will look like for the portfolio of clean energy jobs that our investments in hydrogen and other grid infrastructure, et cetera, are going to create. So I think the point here is, and this is the sort of cheerleader part, right? If we get the recipe right, we have many, many opportunities. I think just a couple of insights, sort of broad strokes from our research include really focusing on the affordability of energy to small and medium-sized manufacturers as we decarbonize the energy mix is really paramount to keep the momentum going. At the same time, production and use of hydrogen, I've been involved at some level with different hub designs. I think we need to focus on where it makes the most economic sense and make sure our comparison cases are the right ones when we choose the first uses of hydrogen. Otherwise, the economics are going to prevent us from growing those investments in the long term. We need to expand a broad range of options for expanding low-carbon power. I think I've said that several times, and I think that's very important, especially as an opportunity for jobs. Establishing an infrastructure to transport and sequester carbon at scales that make sense. Where do we start? I think this is a conversation that you could have across this region. I know there are a number of similar questions. When it comes to infrastructures, it's a natural point to look across state lines and to say, hey, what are your plans? What are our plans? What are our regulatory needs? What are your constraints? Let's think about this, understanding this as a starting point for working together. And I can say yesterday, actually, there was an event organized by Into Market where it brought together folks that are working on these questions from many different fields across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And I'm looking, let's see, I saw Pat Getty earlier in the audience, and Tom, great to see you. But I think just the key point is that we need to find ways to build those networks in areas that we know and understand and can move forward. So there's sort of two pieces to it, right? One is problem solving, the other is maintaining those open lines of communication. And then finally, I think we want to figure out where the local environmental co-benefits, this is the great thing about decarbonization investments, is that many of them will actually help the local environment. And so we want to pursue decarbonization, particularly in those places where you have large environmental co-benefits. Early results looking at steel decarbonization from some of my colleagues at CMU are showing that the steel industry, not only are there large air quality co-benefits of moving to DRI with electric arc furnaces, but there are also significant impacts over disadvantaged communities. Disproportionately, those communities disproportionately benefit from those decarbonization investments because of the improvements in local air quality that come from displacing the coking step. Finally, I think it's really important not to forget that we want to expand our diverse economy, support that with broadband and other connectivity infrastructure that gives us the opportunity to stay connected, but also to live in the places that we want to live. I applaud Nucor's efforts with the daycare, et cetera. I think daycare is another form of infrastructure here that we don't want to leave out of the conversation. So I think those are just a couple of ideas. On the academic side, you might ask, what are we doing? Well, this is just one example. So CMU's joined hands with Pitt and led by West Virginia University. We put in for a large National Science Foundation Engines grant. We're really excited about the opportunity of growing an energy ecosystem here in the region, looking at Ariane and others. Won't call anybody out, especially since there are so many people in this room who had a role in this. But the important thing here is that these types of partnerships in your sectors, those similar kinds of partnerships across regions and across sector boundaries are going to be I think, a fundamental part of building the clean energy future. And so I'd just like to leave you with an invitation to connect with us and all of the great things that others in this room are doing. I'm sure that I've failed to mention many efforts that we are central and important to advancing the energy transition here, and think big, right? What we do here can serve as a model for the ways that technology and organizations can evolve around the world. So with that, thank you very much. Let's grow these ingredients to ensure that a low carbon transition benefits all of the region's people and communities. Thank you, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. Let's see. Carlos and Scott, and maybe.
Hi, Valerie. My name is Clarence, and I'm actually an ESG advisor from Chatham University, so local neighbor of Pittsburgh. And working with CMU and a bunch of the other local universities, how do you kind of see corporations pairing with the universities when it comes towards training, and how can we get students on board to be ready for whether if that is labor-intensive jobs, whether if that's business management, and kind of how do you see yourself at CMU kind of leading students in the way of being ready for almost, if it's industry, private, or government, how do we kind of lead our students in the right direction?
This is a great question. I'll give two examples of things that I think we found to be hopefully promising directions, if not ultimately transformative in the longer term. One is we have project courses together with industry. So we have an industrial sponsor. They work with students, 22 students in a course on techno-economic analysis for low-carbon steel making. And that effort was basically, it gave the students the opportunity to visit the Mon Valley, to tour the plant, to get a sense of how US Steel operates, how they're thinking. So this was one way, and they actually then would sort of work through all the calculations related to decarbonizing specific processes. And so that is one way I think you can, and students found it challenging. And then they had to work with a client. You know, I said, I'm not giving you a grade for this. Your sponsor is actually, going to give you direct feedback. And they received, 10 feedback forms with sort of the straight feedback. So I think more sort of partnerships like that complement, they do not replace, but complement the traditional curriculum. The other, I think, is more, I'm thinking sort of, stronger partnerships and conversations among the four-year universities and the sort of broader representatives of the ecosystem in order to figure out, so how do we retain talent in the region? How do we connect with employers? I think if you have multiple universities working together on a grant, then it becomes easier for a company to say, oh, I'll support that initiative, because then I'm not sort of spreading myself thin, I'm going to have more of an impact. So I think they're like finding those opportunities to partner can be really important. Yes.
Yeah, hi. I really loved your presentation. I hope it was okay. I took pictures of it constantly. I didn't know you were going to provide it. Valerie, maybe you know this gentleman from MIT, Saul Griffith. He wrote a book called Electrify. It came out about a year ago. And his whole premise was the first thing we have to do is just electrify everything, and everything else will fall in place. Does that make sense to you?
So yes, but there are limits, right? So I think we can electrify a lot, and we need to solve the problem that electric power is more difficult to store at present, and we need to solve the problem that oftentimes the electricity system, and that would be, well, assuming we make all the resilience investments, it will still be a single failure point in some of these disasters, right? So we make a lot of investments in resilience, and I think that's a good thing to do, but we don't want to be entirely reliant on electricity for all of our needs. So I think that process will evolve over time. We shouldn't be thinking maybe over time we will have better ways to store, we can produce product. For example, there's a company called Electra that has an iron-making technology that is designed to use intermittent renewable electricity when it's available. And then when it's not available, the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining, then the process ramps down, ramps up again. This is the kind of innovative thinking that we all need to be doing in order to think about how do we use the electricity that we have, how do we grow it, how do we make the grid more capable of working with higher percentages of renewables. And at the same time, hydrogen, natural gas will continue to play a role in firm power generation. I think we should not be shy about moving forward in this region to develop and test carbon capture and sequestration at small scales and with public ownership models, potentially. Ownership models that might make sense for that first demonstration, to build the public confidence and to educate people about what is this? Does it work? If it doesn't work, do something else. But we need to think about this from multiple angles.
Great presentation. I assume you're a fan of microgrids.
I am.
You look like it. Thank you very much.
Other questions? All right, we're out of time, I think, but.
Okay, let's thank Valerie.
Thank you.